The wind howled like a wounded animal across the Montana plains, carrying with it the bitter promise of another merciless night. Thomas McAllister pulled his weathered coat tighter as he checked the fence line one final time before darkness swallowed his small ranch whole. At 42, his face bore the deep lines of a man who had learned that trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he walked the perimeter, each step deliberate and cautious. 3 years had passed since he'd last spoken to another human being for more than a transaction in town. 3 years since Martha died. 3 years since he'd decided that isolation was safer than the pain that came with caring. As he rounded the northern corner of his property, something dark against the white caught his eye. At first, he thought it might be a deer that had collapsed from the cold, but as he drew closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was a young woman, maybe 17 or 18, curled against his fence post like a broken bird. Her long black hair was dusted with snow, and her buckskin clothing offered little protection against the brutal Montana winter. Thomas stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. Native American, obviously. But what was she doing here? His land was miles from any reservation, and the nearest settlement was a day's ride through dangerous territory. His hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his hip as his eyes scanned the horizon for any sign of companions or pursuers. The girl stirred slightly, and he could see her breath forming weak puffs in the freezing air. She was alive, but barely. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint, and her body shook with violent tremors. Thomas found himself caught between his carefully constructed walls of self-preservation and something deeper, something that Martha had always said was his true nature before the world had hardened him. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, holstering his weapon. He couldn't leave her here to die, regardless of what complications she might bring to his carefully ordered solitude. He knelt beside her, noting immediately that she didn't respond to his approach or the sound of his voice. When he gently touched her shoulder, she startled and looked up at him with eyes that held no fear, only a profound exhaustion and resignation that struck him as oddly familiar. Her eyes were dark as coffee beans, and in them he saw intelligence and pain that seemed far too old for her young face. She watched his lips carefully as he spoke, and he realized with a start that she might be deaf. Her gaze was intent, focused, as if she were trying to read meaning from his expressions and gestures rather than his words. "Easy there," he said softly, though he suspected she couldn't hear him. He pointed to himself and said slowly, "Thomas." Then he pointed to her with a questioning expression. She studied his face for a long moment, then looked toward his small cabin visible in the distance. Her eyes returned to his, and she gave the slightest nod, not of introduction, but of understanding. She knew he was offering help, and she was accepting it because she had no other choice. Thomas scooped her up carefully, surprised by how light she was. She felt like little more than bones wrapped in cold buckskin. As he carried her toward his cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was crossing a line he'd sworn never to cross again, the line between safety and caring, between isolation and involvement. The cabin was small but warm, heated by a stone fireplace that Thomas had built with his own hands. He laid her on the old quilt that covered his only bed, then quickly set about building up the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows on the log walls as he heated water and gathered what meager medical supplies he had. As warmth began to fill the room, the girl's shivering gradually subsided. Thomas helped her drink small sips of warm broth, noting how she watched his every movement with those incredibly expressive eyes. There was something about her that seemed familiar, though he couldn't place what it was. "You're safe here," he said, though he knew she couldn't hear him. But somehow, she seemed to understand. She settled back against the pillow, and for the first time since he'd found her, some of the tension left her body. Outside, the wind continued to rage, and Thomas found himself wondering what forces had driven this young woman to his isolated corner of the world. As he watched her finally drift into exhausted sleep, He couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully constructed solitude was about to be shattered in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The fire crackled softly, and Thomas settled into his chair beside the bed, his rifle across his knees. Whatever had brought her here, whatever she was running from, he would keep watch tonight. Tomorrow, he would figure out what to do with her. Tonight, he would simply ensure that she lived to see another dawn. But as he watched her sleep, Thomas McAllister had no idea that within hours, everything he thought he knew about his past, his isolation, and himself would be turned upside down by a single whispered word. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Montana landscape, painting the snow-covered hills in muted shades of silver. Thomas had dozed fitfully in his chair, waking every few hours to check on his unexpected guest and add wood to the fire. Each time he looked at her sleeping form, he felt the uncomfortable stirring of emotions he'd worked hard to bury. The girl woke as the first pale light filtered through the cabin's single window. Her eyes opened slowly, and Thomas watched as awareness returned to her face. First confusion, then memory, then a careful assessment of her surroundings. She sat up slowly, wincing as movement reminded her of her ordeal in the cold. Thomas had prepared a simple breakfast of eggs, bacon, and coffee. He set a plate beside her and gestured for her to eat. She nodded her thanks and ate slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. There was something almost disconcerting about her intense attention, as if she were studying him, reading things in his expression that he didn't even know he was revealing. After she had eaten, Thomas pointed to himself again and repeated his name slowly. Thomas. Then he pointed to her and raised his eyebrows in question. She hesitated for a long moment, then pointed to herself and moved her lips soundlessly. Thomas couldn't make out what she was trying to say, but he nodded encouragingly. She seemed frustrated by the communication barrier, and Thomas found himself wishing he knew how to sign. But then she did something unexpected. She pointed to her chest, then to her lips, and shook her head sadly. Then she pointed to her ears and shook her head again. The message was clear. She was deaf, and she had also lost her ability to speak. But as the morning wore on, Thomas began to notice something strange. Occasionally, when she thought he wasn't looking, the girl would touch her throat and move her lips as if she were testing something. There was something about these moments that suggested her silence might not be as complete as it appeared. Around midday, Thomas heard the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching his cabin. His blood ran cold as he counted at least 4 horses, maybe more. He quickly moved to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains. 5 men on horseback were approaching his property, and even from a distance, he could see they were heavily armed. The girl must have sensed his tension because she was suddenly beside him, looking out the window. When she saw the riders, her face went pale, and Thomas saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. Pure terror. "Friends of yours?" he asked grimly, though he already suspected the answer. She shook her head frantically and pointed to herself, then made a gesture across her throat. These men meant to kill her. Thomas felt his old protective instincts surge to life, instincts he hadn't felt since Martha's death. The riders stopped about 50 yards from the cabin. Their leader, a tall man with a distinctive scar running down his left cheek, called out in a voice that carried clearly across the cold air. "McAllister, we know you're in there. We're looking for something that belongs to us, a young Indian girl. Send her out and we'll leave you in peace." Thomas looked at the girl, who was now trembling, but not from cold. There was something desperate in her eyes, and she grabbed his arm with surprising strength. She pointed to the men, then to herself, then made a cutting motion across her throat. "Who are you?" Thomas whispered, more to himself than to her. The leader called out again. "McAllister, don't make this harder than it needs to be. The girl is a runaway. We're just here to take her back where she belongs." But Thomas had spent enough years on the frontier to recognize bounty hunters when he saw them. These weren't men acting out of any sense of justice or law. These were men who killed for money. The girl suddenly tugged on his sleeve, and when he looked down at her, she was pointing to her throat again. This time, she opened her mouth and took a deep breath, as if gathering every ounce of strength she possessed. And then, in a voice so soft it was barely more than a whisper, she spoke a single word that hit Thomas like a physical blow. "Papa." Thomas staggered backward, his face going white. The word hung in the air between them like a ghost from his past. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But as he looked at her face, really looked at it for the first time, he began to see features that were achingly familiar. The shape of her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking. "No," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You can't be." But even as he said it, he knew it was true. This girl, this young woman he'd found freezing at his fence line, was his daughter. The daughter he'd been told had died with her mother 18 years ago when their village was attacked. The daughter he'd mourned and buried in his heart, whose loss had driven him to this isolated existence. The girl, his daughter, reached out and touched his face gently, and Thomas saw tears streaming down her cheeks. She nodded slowly, confirming what his heart was already screaming. Outside, the bounty hunters were growing impatient. "McAllister, last warning." Thomas looked at his daughter, this brave young woman who had somehow survived when he'd been told she was dead, who had found her way to him across impossible odds. Then he looked toward the window where armed men waited to take her away, probably to kill her. His hand moved to his rifle, and for the first time in 3 years, Thomas McAllister felt something worth fighting for. The careful walls he'd built around his heart came crashing down, replaced by a fierce protective rage that burned hotter than any fire. "Stay down," he told his daughter, his voice steady and cold. "Papa's going to take care of this." As he moved toward the door, Thomas realized that the isolated, broken man who had found a freezing girl yesterday was gone forever. In his place stood a father who had just gotten his daughter back and would die before he let anyone take her away again. The standoff stretched across the frozen landscape like a held breath. Thomas positioned himself behind the heavy wooden door, his rifle ready, while his daughter crouched near the fireplace where she'd be protected by the stone chimney. His mind raced as he tried to process the impossible truth. His child, whom he'd mourned for 18 years, was alive and hiding in his cabin. "Time's up, McAllister," the scarred leader shouted. "We're coming in." "Like hell you are," Thomas called back, his voice carrying the deadly calm of a man with nothing left to lose. "This is my land, and the girl is under my protection." A harsh laugh echoed across the yard. "Your protection? You don't even know what she is, do you? What she's done?" Thomas glanced at his daughter, who was watching the exchange with those intelligent dark eyes. Whatever these men claimed about her, he could see the truth in her face. She was terrified, but there was no guilt there, no shame, only the fear of someone who had been hunted. "Enlighten me," Thomas called out, buying time while he assessed his tactical situation. 5 men, all armed, spread out in a semicircle around his cabin. He had the advantage of cover and position, but they had numbers. "That little deaf girl is worth $1,000 to certain parties in Washington," the leader replied. "Seems she witnessed something she shouldn't have. Something involving a certain Indian agent and some missing funds meant for the reservation." Thomas felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Corruption, missing money, a witness who couldn't speak, until now. No wonder they wanted her dead. His daughter moved closer to him, staying low. She pulled on his sleeve and pointed to the back of the cabin, then made a series of quick gestures. Even without knowing sign language, her meaning was clear. There was another way out, and she wanted him to escape while he could. Thomas shook his head firmly. "I'm not leaving you," he said softly. "Not again. Never again." She looked confused by his words, but before he could explain further, the sound of splintering wood came from the rear of the cabin. They were coming from both directions. "She's got you fooled, McAllister," the leader continued his psychological assault, "playing on your sympathies. But she's not some innocent victim. She's been running cons with her tribe, using that deaf act to get close to Marks. Thomas knew it was a lie even before his daughter shook her head sadly. The pain in her eyes when she touched her ears was too real, too deep. Whatever had happened to her, whatever she'd endured, her deafness wasn't an act. A shot rang out, shattering the window glass. Thomas returned fire immediately, his bullet taking down one of the men who had gotten too aggressive. His daughter didn't flinch at the gunshot, confirming what he already knew about her hearing. "Now you've done it, old man," the leader snarled. "That was my cousin you just killed." More shots erupted, and Thomas found himself in the kind of firefight he hadn't faced since his younger days. But muscle memory took over, and he moved with the fluid efficiency of a man who had survived worse odds. Between shots, he caught glimpses of his daughter helping in the only way she could, staying out of his line of fire while keeping watch for threats he might miss. During a brief lull in the shooting, she tugged on his arm again. This time, when he looked at her, she pointed to herself and then to the door. She was offering to give herself up to protect him. "Absolutely not," Thomas said firmly, reloading his rifle. "We're in this together now." She studied his face for a moment, then did something that nearly broke his heart. She placed her hand over her heart, then reached out and placed it over his. Then pointed to herself and mouthed a single word. "Daughter." She knew. Somehow, she had figured out who he was. Thomas nodded, his eyes burning with unshed tears. "That's right, sweetheart. You're my daughter, and I'm never letting you go again." For the first time since he'd found her, she smiled. It was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds, and Thomas felt something in his chest that he'd thought had died with Martha. The back door exploded inward, and two men rushed through the opening. Thomas spun and fired, catching one in the shoulder and sending him spinning back outside. The second man got off a shot that splintered the wood inches from Thomas's head before his daughter, moving with surprising speed, swung a cast-iron pan that caught the intruder square in the temple. The man dropped like a stone. "Good girl," Thomas said, grinning despite their desperate situation. But their victory was short-lived. The leader and his remaining men were closing in, and Thomas knew they were running out of ammunition and options. That's when his daughter did something unexpected. She moved to the window and, despite the danger, looked out at the remaining attackers. Then she began to sign rapidly, her hands moving in complex patterns that Thomas couldn't understand, but somehow looked familiar. One of the remaining men outside saw her and suddenly lowered his weapon, speaking rapidly to the leader in what sounded like heated argument. "What is it?" the leader demanded. "What's she saying?" The man who had been watching her signs looked shaken. "Boss," she's saying. "She's saying she's Mika Lister's daughter, and she's asking for protection under the old treaties." The leader's scarred face twisted with rage. "I don't care if she's the president's daughter. She's worth $1,000, and—" His words were cut off by the sound of hoofbeats, many hoofbeats, approaching from the east. Thomas looked out carefully and felt his heart skip a beat. At least 20 Native American warriors were riding hard toward his cabin, their war paint gleaming in the weak winter sun. His daughter had somehow signaled for help, but Thomas wasn't sure if the approaching riders meant rescue or just a different kind of danger. As the warriors surrounded the remaining bounty hunters, their leader raised his hands and began to speak in a language Thomas didn't understand. But his daughter understood. She listened intently, then turned to Thomas with hope in her eyes for the first time since he'd found her. She pointed to the warriors, then to herself, then made a protective gesture. They had come for her. They had come to take her home. But as Thomas watched his daughter prepare to leave with her people, he realized that losing her again might be more than his newly awakened heart could bear. The standoff in Thomas's yard had shifted dramatically with the arrival of the Native American warriors. Their leader, a man of perhaps 50 with streaks of gray in his long black hair and eyes that held the weight of hard-won wisdom, dismounted and approached the cabin with his hands visible but ready. Thomas's daughter stood at the window, her face a mixture of relief and something else, uncertainty. She signed rapidly to the warrior leader, who listened intently before responding in the same fluid hand language. Thomas watched this exchange, feeling like an outsider to his own daughter's life. The scarred bounty hunter leader was clearly calculating odds that had suddenly turned very much against him. "This doesn't concern you people," he called out to the warriors. "This is white man's business." The warrior leader's expression didn't change, but Thomas caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested barely controlled anger. When he spoke, his English was precise and measured. "The girl is under our protection. She is family." Thomas felt a stab of something he didn't want to acknowledge. Of course she was family to them. They had raised her, protected her, loved her when he had thought her dead. What claim did he have after 18 years of absence? His daughter turned from the window and approached him carefully. She pointed to herself, then to the warriors outside, then to him. Her expression was questioning, almost pleading. She was asking him to come with her, to meet her family, the family that had saved her when his couldn't. The bounty hunters were outnumbered and outgunned now, but their leader wasn't giving up easily. "That girl is a federal witness," he shouted. "You're interfering with official business. Show us your warrant." The warrior leader replied calmly, "Show us your badge. Show us anything that makes this official business rather than murder for money." The silence that followed was answer enough. Thomas made his decision. He set his rifle aside and opened the cabin door, stepping out with his hands visible. His daughter followed close behind him, and Thomas could see the moment when the warrior leader's eyes widened slightly in recognition. "You are Thomas McAllister," the older man said. It wasn't a question. "I am. I am Joseph Standing Bear. I knew your wife Sarah Laughingwind, and I have raised your daughter since she was brought to us as a child." The words hit Thomas like physical blows. Sarah Laughingwind, that had been her native name, the name she used with her own people. And this man had been caring for their daughter all these years, had given her the love and protection that Thomas had been unable to provide. "Is she ... Thomas started, then stopped. Was she happy? Joseph's stern expression softened slightly. "She spoke of you often, especially in the early years. She never stopped hoping you would find each other again." He paused, studying Thomas's face. "Your daughter has told me what you did for her, how you protected her. For this, you have my gratitude." Thomas's daughter stepped forward and began signing rapidly to Joseph, her movements urgent and expressive. Joseph listened, occasionally asking what appeared to be clarifying questions. Finally, he nodded and turned back to Thomas. "She tells me she has found her father," Joseph said, "but she also tells me she wishes to return to our village, to the people who raised her. She asks if you will come with us to see the life she has built, to meet the family that has loved her." Thomas felt his throat constrict. "And after that?" "That choice will be hers to make," Joseph replied simply. "She is a woman now, free to choose her own path. But she should not have to choose between two families who love her." One of the bounty hunters, perhaps emboldened by desperation, suddenly raised his rifle. The movement was fast, but Joseph was faster. Before Thomas could even react, the warrior leader had put an arrow through the man's shoulder, sending him spinning to the ground. The message was clear. There would be no more violence here today. The scarred leader, seeing his last man down and surrounded by experienced warriors, finally raised his hands in surrender. "This isn't over," he snarled. "There are others who want the girl. They'll keep coming." "Let them come," Joseph said quietly, "but they will not find her unprotected." Thomas's daughter moved to stand between the two men who had shaped her life, the father who had given her life and the man who had given her childhood and safety. She looked back and forth between them, and Thomas could see her struggling with something. Finally, she approached Thomas and placed her hand over his heart again, as she had during the fight. Then she turned to Joseph and repeated the gesture. The meaning was clear. Both men held a place in her heart, and she couldn't choose between them. "There is room in our village for a man who would protect his daughter as you did today," Joseph said to Thomas. "If you choose to come, you would be welcome not as a guest, but as family." Thomas looked at his daughter, at this brave young woman who had somehow found her way back to him across impossible odds. Then he looked at Joseph, seeing the genuine respect in the older man's eyes. For 18 years he had lived in isolation, convinced that caring led only to loss. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running from the possibility of love. "I have nothing left here," Thomas said simply. "If my daughter wants me with her people, then that's where I belong." His daughter's face lit up with a joy so pure it took Thomas's breath away. She threw her arms around him in a fierce hug, and for the first time in 18 years, Thomas McAllister allowed himself to believe that he might have a family again. As they prepared to leave the cabin that had been Thomas's refuge and prison, his daughter tugged on his sleeve one more time. When he looked down at her, she pointed to her throat and took a deep breath. Then, in that same whisper-soft voice that had shattered his world yesterday, she spoke again. "Thank you, Papa, for coming home." The bounty hunters were left tied up for the territorial marshal to find. The cabin stood empty as the group rode away across the Montana plains, but it was no longer a monument to isolation and loss. Now it was just a building, left behind by a man who had finally found something worth more than his solitude. As they rode toward the village that would become Thomas's new home, his daughter rode beside him and Joseph on her other side. The winter wind still blew cold across the plains, but Thomas no longer felt its bite. For the first time in years, he was warm from the inside out. Behind them, the empty cabin grew smaller in the distance. Ahead lay the promise of family, belonging, and the chance to be the father he had never had the opportunity to become. And beside him rode the miracle that had made it all possible, his daughter, who had whispered one word and changed everything.